brothers and sisters. As we commence tonight's lecture, I would like to begin by recognizing our sponsors once again for tonight's program. The families of brothers Sajjad Zaidi, Danish Jawa, Khurram Jawa, Shujat Qadir, Sarfraz Hussain, Abbas Akbar, Qazim Hussain, and Asad Abadi request that you remember the marhumin of your families and the marhumin of their families. Please join me in reciting the Surah Fatiha, preceded by As-Salawat ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. Brothers and sisters, there's also one additional announcement. There's some immediate family members of one of the sponsors who's in poor health and is in need of your du'as from tonight's group of sponsors. They have requested if we can all collectively recite loud salawat for their health and well-being, inshallah. Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. As we begin tonight's lecture, I would ask those who are planning on leaving, the brothers and sisters who are in the coat rooms and in the hallways, please do so as quietly as possible. We also request that you not congregate in those coat rooms as the sound comes here in the inside of the masjid. And it interferes with the lecture. And I'd also request if some of the brothers who are volunteers, if we can close those doors also for the sisters once everyone has left. And two more things out of respect for Shayk Rizwan. If you have cell phones, again, please, I would kindly request you to turn them on silent or on vibrate. And those of you with young children, there is a multi-purpose room. Mothers are requested to kindly utilize that space as they can listen to the program from the multi-purpose room. And then lastly, the ziyarat will take place at the conclusion of the lecture. And so with that, please join me in reciting a loud salawat for Hujjat al-Islam, Shayk Rizwan Arastu, to come to the podium at this time.
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء محمد وعلى أهل بيته الطيبين الطاهرين اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقه قولي أما بعد. We spent these 2 weeks together going through the verses of the Quran that talk about nifaq. As I mentioned yesterday, we've only touched the surface. We've gone through maybe 20 or 30 verses, but there are many more in the Quran, and there's still more concepts to be understood and uncovered for all of us. But at least we have a good introduction. We've brought it to our mind. We've reflected on some of the verses, looked at some of the attributes that Allah has mentioned of munafiqeen, and hopefully be able to use that to reflect on ourselves and see if there are seeds of that nifaq within ourselves, and then address those and first pray to Allah and then also work within ourselves to try to get rid of those attributes of munafiqeen. Starting yesterday and then today and tomorrow, inshallah, what I want to do is there are certain practices that we have as Muslims, certain behaviors that are sanctioned, we're even encouraged to do, sometimes it's even wajib to do, that resemble in some way on the surface nifaq, two-facedness. And so I wanted to address these so we can understand these things better. Yesterday we looked at taqiyya, the practice of taqiyya, And we wanted to see how is this different from nifaq. Today, I want to take a look at lying. Kidhb is one of the major sins, right? Clear sin and a clear tool in the toolkit of a munafiq, because his inside and his outside are incongruous. He has to lie to say, I believe, when in fact he doesn't believe. And it's a tool that people in the world use to deceive others, to cover up their own faults, to attain some ulterior motive. And so kidhb, lying, is forbidden. It's a sin. It's one of those qualities that's kind of the root of evil akhlaq. If you have a kind of lying as a habit and lying is part of your personality, having sadaqah, being sadiq, being true, being honest, being kind of transparent, plain, those are attributes of a good believer. And kidhb is the exact opposite of that. All right, so that's in its own place. But we have instances where lying is actually permitted, perhaps even wajib. And so we need to understand what those are as well, so that we can see that it's not black and white. There are instances where you are able to, even you must say opposite of what's real, what's true, for certain purposes. And so we should understand what is what are the parameters of those sanctions that we have for telling lies. So first of all, one lesson that we get from ahadith is that when at all possible, even in these instances where lying is sanctioned, as I'll mention, even in those instances, if at all possible, we are encouraged and even required to try to use what's called tawriya. Tawriya is, it comes from the word to hide something, but it's used in the sense of double entendre. If those younger people in your literature lessons, one of the literary devices that people use is double entendre. You say one thing, but it has two meanings. Right? You mean one thing, but the audience or the person you're speaking to understands something different. Right? So if you are able to use words like that in a way that's not an outright lie, but rather one possible meaning is true and one possible meaning is false, and you use that with the truth in mind, and if the other person understands the other meaning, that's on him, that's not on you. So that's the technique we're supposed to try to use. I'll give you a couple of examples from some stories that we have. One story is narrated for various companions of Amir al-Mu'mineen and Imam Hassan alayhi as-salam. I remember it from the story of Sa'sa' ibn Sawhan. Sa'sa' is a very interesting, beautiful name. Sa'sa' ibn Sawhan and his brother Zayd ibn Sawhan. If you've ever gone to Masjid Sahla in Kufa, so there's two masjids just near Masjid Sahla that are associated with these two individuals. Outstanding people, companions of Amir al-Mu'mineen. Sa'sa' in particular was extremely eloquent. He had a sharp tongue that he used for truth, for good. And Amir al-Mu'mineen would call on him to be a spokesperson, to go as his representative and these kinds of things. And he was known for that. So in the period after Nahrawan, there's this lull of Imam Ali's force and ability to be effective. And in the meantime, while he's not able to motivate his troops to rise up again against Muawiyah and to go back to Safin to finish him off, Muawiyah starts to send raids into the Iraqi lands. And the whole idea was to terrorize the followers of Amir al-Mu'mineen and make it so they didn't want to fight him again, because they saw him as someone very powerful and not someone to mess with. One of the practices that Muawiyah started to do, he would not only do la'n of Amir al-Mu'mineen and the Ahlul Bayt, he would also call on companions who were known to be associated with Amir al-Mu'mineen and ask them to do la'n as well, as a test of faith, as a kind of a torture for them, and to also spread his own propaganda through the tongues of people who are known to be associates of the Ahlul Bayt. So in one instance, he calls on the Sa'a to do it. And he says that, he makes some threat and says, you have to go and you have to go on the minbar and you have to do la'an of Amir al-Mu'mineen. So Sa'a, being the orator, being clever, he goes up and he says some things, and finally he uses the following phrase. He says, Allahumma la'an man bintuhu fi baytihi. Right, so he calls down la'an on, now this, who he's referring to could be one of two people. Man bintuhu fi baytihi. If you're referring to the daughter of the Prophet being in his house, that's referring to Amir al-Mu'mineen. Right? Amir al-Mu'mineen, in whose house is the daughter of the Prophet. So that's what Muawiyah hears, that's what the audience hears, because they're used to the la'an of Amir al-Mu'mineen. But what Sa'sa intends is he's doing la'an on the person whose daughter is in the Prophet's house. Man bintuhu fi baytihi. His daughter is in his house. Right? So whose daughter and who's the person whose daughter is in whose house? All of that, they're pronouns, so there's a lot of ambiguity in the phrase. And so very craftily, very cleverly, he uses the sentence to satisfy Muawiyah on one hand, but on the other hand, save himself from doing a la'an against his own desire. He could have just outright refused, but then he would have faced the consequences. Maybe he would have been killed or tortured or beat up or whatever. But this was a clever way to get out of the situation and at the same time do an ibadah on one hand and make the zalim pleased at the same time. So this is called tawriyah. Tawriyah is it's kind of lie, but it's a double entendre. You're saying something that can be interpreted in two ways. You intend one, which is true, and the other meaning is false, and the other person is presumably going to hear the false thing that you're saying. Another example comes in the story of Yusuf in Surah Yusuf. So in the incident where Zalikha tries to seduce Yusuf, usually in Urdu and Farsi people say Zulaykha, but apparently the Arabic pronunciation is Zalikha. So Zalikha goes to seduce Yusuf, who is her basically adopted son, someone she's brought into her household from childhood and raised, and now she's tempted and she tries to tempt him. وَلَقَدْ هَمَّتْ بِهِ. She desired him. وَهَمَّ بِهَا لَوْلَا أَرَّأَ بُرْهَانَ رَبِّهِ. And he would have also desired her had it not been for the fact that Allah showed him with clarity what it is that's in front of him, so he could avoid that sin because he saw it as sin. And the problem is sometimes when you face sin, the desire is so much that you justify and you say this isn't really that sinful. There are good reasons why I should do it, and it's not really that bad. And you can convince yourself in the moment to do the bad thing. And it's only afterwards when the desire subsides and now your mind takes over that you realize actually it was a terrible thing to do. So Yusuf alayhi salam, Allah showed him that burhan, showed him with clarity the reality of what was in front of him, so he could avoid it while he was in the moment instead of having to face the consequences afterwards. Then Allah quotes him and says, قَالَ مَعَاذَ اللَّهِ. And Yusuf seeks refuge in Allah from giving into his temptation. مَعَاذَ اللَّهِ. Then he says, إِنَّهُ رَبِّي أَحْسَنَ مَثْوَاي. Right. This إِنَّهُ رَبِّي أَحْسَنَ مَثْوَاي, the ha here, for those of you who know Arabic, it's not إِنَّهُ رَبِّي period. He's not saying he is my Lord. The ha, ignore it from translation. It's like the huwa and قُلْ هُوَ اللَّهُ أَحَدٌ. Usually قُلْ هُوَ اللَّهُ أَحَدٌ, people who learned a little bit of Arabic, they say he, there's a huwa, he is God one. And it doesn't really make any sense. That huwa in Arabic, in this kind of sentence structure, should be ignored. It's like a colon. Say the following: God is one. Right? Say colon, God is one. So here also, إِنَّهُ رَبِّي أَحْسَنَ مَثْوَاي. He's saying that my Lord has brought me into this household out of His grace. So he wants to remember the kindness that his Lord has shown him as a child who has been cast out by his brothers, who was forgotten as dead, who was sold and bought like merchandise. He was a nobody, and Allah brought him into this household, and that's the best household that he could have been brought into, where he had all the material needs that he had, and he was raised, and he had position now. So from nowhere and as a nobody, with the whole world conspiring against him, Allah found a way to put him into a household and make him eventually the king of all of Egypt. So he, in this moment, remembers that Rabbi ahsana mathwai, my Lord has brought me into this household and put me in the best position. How can I be so ungrateful to bite the hand that feeds me? If my Lord has done all this for me, I can't go against him. So when he says this, Rabbi, what does Yusuf intend? He's talking about Allah. Allah is the one who's put him into this household and had all this grace on him. And he doesn't want to betray God, who has been so kind to him, by sinning. But what does Zarikha here? Rabbi ahsana mathwai, my Lord, meaning your husband, my adoptive father, the master of this household, he has been so kind to me. So he chooses his words very carefully. Even in that moment that was very sensitive, he chose his words very carefully. So he is remembering his God, and he's reminding her of the Lord of the house, her husband, his benefactor, who's given him so much blessing by bringing him into the household. How can how can you betray the Lord of this house? Right? So with one sentence, one word, Rabb, he communicates these two things at the same time. It's both a reminder for himself and it's a reminder for Zarikha. This is a kind of tawriya. He didn't need to lie in this case, but he was using words very carefully for these dual purposes. Both purposes are intended. One is for himself and one is for her. But it's a kind of tawriya where there's two meanings coming from a single set of words. Recite salawat ala Muhammad wa ala. So what we've talked about so far is that lying is haram in and of itself. If we are ever cornered in a way that we have to lie for one of these justified purposes that I'll talk about, the choice, the preference is to try to minimize the lie by using tawriya. If you can manage it, then use words that are not completely false, even though the person might hear that false meaning, but it's also justifiably true. Now, what are those circumstances where we're allowed to lie? One is similar to what we talked about yesterday. Taqiyya could take on the form of lying. When you're in a position where there's severe harm for yourself, harm for your life, your bodily safety, your property, your honor, and not only you as an individual, but also those people that you have control over, your family, even fellow believers, or the deen itself. Right? So any of these things that are sacred, that require guarding and protection, if they are in danger, then and there's no way to escape from it, then we are allowed to resort to lying if need be. Like, very easy example: somebody comes to your house and has a gun and says, where's your father to the kids? Now this is not the time to say, be honest and say, yes, he's at home. Let me call him. Just 1 second. This is the time to lie. To find any way to say he's not here, he's gone out, he won't be back for a while, he's on vacation, something else to get this person to go away, because obviously he wants to hurt that person. This is not the time for being honest. And that kind of a lie is, very rationally, in a common sense kind of calculation, it's very normal to do. And Islam also justifies that and says that's exactly, in fact, in this circumstance, if you were to tell the truth, that would be the wrong thing to do. Lying becomes your duty. This becomes wajib for the protection of the life of this person whose life is in danger. Another instance would be in testimony. So even bearing testimony, or let's say not testimony, but like oaths. So we have these different kinds of oaths. People from the subcontinent, we use the word nazr a lot. Nadhr with a dal becomes nazr in Urdu. We use it incorrectly. People will say, I have a nazr, and what they mean is they have some food that they prepared, and I don't know, they read some surah or something on it, and now it becomes special holy food. That's not an Islamic concept. The Islamic concept of nadhr, it's an oath that you're making with Allah, a promise you're making with Allah. There's a special formula in Arabic that you have to recite, right? And you say, for instance, lillahi alayya, and then you say whatever you want to do, which now creates an obligation on you, makes something wajib on you that normally isn't wajib. And I could do anything. I could say, lillahi alayya, for instance, sawmu yawmin. One fast is now wajib on me as an oath to God. So if I say that with seriousness, then it becomes obligatory. And sometime after the month of Ramadan, I have to fulfill one fast for the sake of Allah. If I die and I don't fulfill the fast, then I've fallen short. I've broken a haram. And you can make it negative or positive. You can say, I make this commitment to do something, or I make a commitment not to do something. Right? So if you were trying to avoid some sort of haram activity that you have a habit of or you're tempted to, then to make it increasingly kind of up the stakes and make it more of a kind of a disincentive to avoid that activity, then you could make another and say, lillahi alayya, that I never smoke a cigarette again, for instance, or I never eat this kind of harmful food or do this kind of haram activity or whatever it might be. But then the consequence is that now if you do fall into that sin or activity, you do it, so not only is it haram normally, but now because of your nadhr, you have to do kafara of the nadhr as well. Right? So the stakes are higher. Now that's what you're trying to do. I mean, you're trying to train yourself by increasing the stakes. We do it with other things for dieting and health incentives and things. We come up with different kind of commitments. We have a resolution and maybe make a pact with a friend or a spouse and say we have to do such and such, lose this much weight, never do this activity, whatever it is, and we put some sort of conditions and certain prizes or disincentives depending on what we're trying to accomplish. So this is now a pact with God that's binding. And if you break it, then فَكَفَّارَتُهُ إِطْعَامُ عَشَرَةِ مَسَاكِينَ أَوْ كِسْوَتُهُمْ أَوْ تَحْرِيرُ رَقَبَةٍ in the verse of the Quran. They're one of three things. Either you have to feed 10 poor people, إِطْعَامُ عَشَرَةِ مَسَاكِينَ مِنْ أَوْسَطِ مَا تُطْعِمُونَ أَهْلِيكُمْ, if I got the verse right. So what kind of food, the average food that you feed your own family. So you can't say let's give cheap food to the poor. No, the same kind of food you feed your own family, you have to give a full meal to 10 poor people. Or you have to clothe 10 people, again with a full garment that you would use for your own family. Or in the olden days you could free a slave. But there was a heavy kind of kafara, penance that you have to pay for breaking such a nadhr. So whether it's a nadhr and qasam and ahd, these are three different words that are used for the same kind of idea. And they're different formulas, but you have to say the formula. The nadhr that a lot of times Indians, Pakistanis will do, they don't never say the formula. So it's not actually binding, there's nothing binding, it's not an Islamic practice at all, it's just a cultural practice that people have come up with. Right? If you want to do a nadhr, you'd have to say, for instance, lillahi alayya, that I feed 100 people. And now it becomes obligatory on you to have 100 people over, and you make sure you feed all of them, for instance. You create some obligation for yourself. But blessing food by reading Quran over, this is not an Islamic practice. There's no sunnah for doing something like that. All right, so back to our topic, we're talking about false oaths that you could make. If you were to make a false oath under normal circumstances, that's terrible. Right? You're lying against Allah, now there's kafara for that. But in circumstances where, again, there's harm, there's danger, the stakes are high, and for instance, someone's asking, they come to the door and they're saying, is your spouse home? And they're ready to hurt them or kill them or something, and you say, no, they're not here. They say, do you swear? I say, yes, wallahi. And I take an oath of God's name to say that they're not there when they actually are there. Right? That's a false oath, but because the reason for taking the false oath is correct, that's excused. And that's actually the right thing to do. All right? So these are certain circumstances where lying and giving a false kind of a nadhr or oath and these kinds of things is either permissible or even obligatory. Another instance where lying is permitted and even encouraged is in what's called islahul bayn, to mend ties between Muslims. Right, so in one hadith, Imam Ja'far as-Sadiq alayhi salam says, he says that al-kalam thalatha, sidqun wa kidhbun wa islahul bayn. There are three categories of speech. You have true speech, which is sidq, and false lying speech, which is kidhb, a lie. And then a third category, he says, is whatever you have to say to get people back together. Islahu dhat al-bayn, or al-islah bayn al-mu'mineen, improving the ties, mending ties that are broken or about to be broken. That justifies saying whatever you have to say to get that relationship back together. Because that relationship between believers is sacred and very important. So for instance, if you are between a husband and a wife who are having some friction or having some trouble, then you're trying to help them and mend the ties between them. Maybe they're not talking to each other anymore. And each one feels that, I can't tolerate her because of certain things, and she can't tolerate him because of certain things, and they have so many bad feelings between them. Now, if you, as a trusted arbiter, come in the middle and are able to go to the husband, for instance, and say that your wife is really missing you, and she says something very good about you, something that's plausible and effective, but you say something, make up something even, that she said that will make him a little soft. So he says, oh really, she said that about me. She still has those kinds of feelings. It kind of breaks that anger in him, and the same thing on her side, that he really wants to make up, and he really wants the relationship to last and the marriage to last, and then it makes her feel like, oh, if he really still has soft feelings for me. If it softens them so they can come back together, that kind of false lie is justified. Not only justified, but actually that's the right thing to do. That's your duty in that circumstance. Not only between spouses, but between believers. And two people have broken ties for whatever reason, and so you come and you try to tell each one something and even create a story so that the two will come back together. Now, it has to be done very carefully. It shouldn't be something that's going to be found out and then it'll cause even worse rift, for instance. Right? But it has to be done carefully, with wisdom, with a lot of compassion for the two. And the whole goal is to try to bring them back together. Reciting salawat ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. Another instance where lying is allowed and even very rational and justified is in war. So there's a famous statement that's attributed to the Prophet, al-harbu khud'a. War is all about strategy and trickery and trying to outmaneuver the person. One example that I can think of for this is in the aftermath of the Battle of Uhud. And it's not the only place, every battle you'll find examples of this, but this is one clear example. So after the Battle of Uhud, when the Muslims have lost because of the failure of the archers, because they left their posts and Khalid bin Walid was able to rout the Muslim army, in the aftermath of all of that, the Quraysh leave, and Rasulullah sends Imam Ali alayhi salam behind them to make sure they're actually going and not going to turn around. So they leave, and then at some point the Quraysh turn around, and they decide that they're broken right now. Let's go back and finish them off. And so they turn around and start coming back, but Rasulullah has spies to let him know that they're on their way back. So he goes and he takes a very small force, but he meets them at a place called Hamra'ul Asad. So somewhere between Medina and Mecca. And they go there at night, And what Rasulullah does, even though he has a very small force, and the Meccans still have nearly 1,000 people, they've only lost some 30 or so people in the Battle of Uhud. Not 1,000, 3,000. So 3,000 people, and they've only lost a few dozen in the battle. The Prophet has only a fraction of that number. On the battlefield of Uhud, he only had 1,000. Many have died, many stayed behind. Now he only has a handful of people. What he does, as they set up camp at night, he takes 500 torches, and he has them set up at large distances from one another. So across the horizon now, he has these torches set up that makes it look from across the field, it makes it look like there's a huge force that Rasulullah has been able to amass to now face the Quraysh. And because of that illusion that he created, the Quraysh decide against confronting him, and they leave in the night. And by morning, they can take all the torches down and everything's done. It was just an illusion, just to give the impression that we have a huge force that requires this much light and this much space, and the tents must be so far apart, and there's so many of them that we have this much light. It was just an illusion, just a trick, but it was effective in stopping another war and more bloodshed. So it's a lie. It's an illusion, it's a lie, but it's perfectly justified. It's good strategy in war to be able to do these kinds of things. Or if you think in the Battle of Badr, actually Allah is responsible for these kinds of illusions. He's the one who created these illusions so that each side saw the other with different numbers than reality. He tells us about it in Surah Al-Anfal. إِذْ يُرِيكَهُمُ اللَّهُ فِي مَنَامِكَ قَلِيلًا. So Allah talks about a time when He showed the enemy of the Prophet to him in a vision or a dream, and he saw that they have very small numbers. وَلَوْ أَرَاكَهُمْ كَثِيرًا لَفَشِلْتُمْ وَلَتَنَازَعْتُمْ فِي الْأَمْرِ وَلَكِنَّ اللَّهَ سَلَّمَ. If Allah had shown you the reality of the fact that it's 1,000 people you're going to be facing with your ragtag band of 313, then once the Prophet told them that we're going to be facing an army of 1,000 that are armed to the teeth, the Muslims would not have been able to have the courage to face them in battle. So Allah showed the Prophet that you're actually facing a very small army, very manageable, that you can handle. And the Prophet communicates that to his soldiers, so they also stand firm and wait for the battle to commence. Then he says, وَإِذْ يُرِيكُمُوهُمْ إِذِ الْتَقَيْتُمْ فِي أَعْيُنِكُمْ قَلِيلًا وَيُقَلِّلُكُمْ فِي أَعْيُنِهِمْ. Then when they got to the battlefield also, Allah shows the Muslims themselves, when they look across the battlefield and see 1,000 soldiers on the other side, what they see is that they don't outnumber us at all. It looks like they're the same as us. He changes the perception of the Muslims, so when they see the mushrikeen, they see them as less than they actually are. So the Muslims will stand firm. And at the same time, he also shows the Quraysh that the Muslims are very few. Well, they actually were very few, but he makes that point because he wants the battle to happen. Allah's point is He wants the two to meet, He wants the battle to happen, He wants the Muslims to wipe out these heads of Quraysh. If they sign a truce, if they miss each other, if they don't fight, then Allah's purpose is not served. Because He wants these heads of Quraysh to be killed. But then as soon as the battle starts and they're engaged, at that point Allah changes the perception of the mushrikeen, and suddenly they see the numbers that are really there. They see that not only is it 313, now there are 1,000, 2,000, 3,000 angels also in the ranks of the Muslims, and suddenly they're in the middle of the battle, they've already engaged, and now they see there's a huge army that they can't withstand. So Allah shifts the perceptions like this of both the believers and the mushrikeen during the battle, before the battle, so that He manages things and makes sure that the engagement happens, everyone stays on the battlefield, and then once the engagement starts, He wants to instill fear in the hearts of the mushrikeen so they lose their own confidence and the Muslims are able to cut into them. This is also khud'ah, this is on Allah's part. He's creating the lie now, the false perceptions that are against what the reality is on the ground. And that's, in His wisdom, this was the best thing, and it was, in fact, the best thing for the Muslims in this early battle. One more lie I'll talk about, which is a justified lie that we all say when we participate in janazah prayers. So in janazah prayers, one of the mustahab things that we say as a dua in between the fourth and the fifth takbir is Allahumma inna la na'lamu minhu illa khayra. The janazah is there in front of us, man or woman, somebody who is from our community. None of us are ma'soom. Very rarely will we have the ability to do a janazah for a person who's truly sinless. Yet, one of the recommended things to say is to say, "Oh Allah, we know nothing of this person but goodness. We only know goodness from him." When, very likely he did sin, she did commit sins, and maybe we even know about that. If we've lived very closely with the person, then we know their ups and downs. Yet we're told to testify in this way, Allahumma inna la na'lamu minhu or minha illa khayra. We know nothing from this person but goodness. So what justifies that? This is a lie too. It's a false statement in many cases, if not most cases. So our scholars say that there are a couple of explanations. So we know that we're supposed to say this. That's there. It's in hadith. It's in our guidance. Now we have to understand, how does this fit with the principles of telling the truth and not lying. So one explanation that our scholars give is that this is also an example. It's an exception to the rule against lying. Just like you can tell those white lies to bring people back together again and mend those relationships, that maybe this is also one of those. This is also one of those exceptions to the rule against lying, and for different benefits that you can guess at. He wants the Muslims to stand there in the last moment that this person is going to be above ground and testify that they've never seen anything but goodness from him. Why? Because he's told us that if a person, 40 believers will testify that this person is good, then Allah will forgive him for whatever sins he might have committed. Now, one way to understand that is that these things that people do, the du'as that you say for me, the du'a that we say for this person in the janazah prayer, the salawat and the fatihas that are called for our deceased, all of these things are a factor of the person's own beliefs. And to the extent that I am a good person, that I've had good relations with people, I've influenced people, then when I die, you will remember me. Maybe my children will remember me for a bit. If I've had some good influence on them, then maybe for one generation they'll still think of me well. If I've had more impact, then maybe for 5 generations, and 10 generations, maybe they'll think of me. And depending on how much good I've done, how much impact I've had, then people will do things like this. Acts of goodness, prayers. If I'm a nobody, if I've not touched anyone, I've never been connected with anyone, I've never done a favor for anyone, nobody really, whether I'm there or not there, doesn't make a difference. Nobody knows me because I never do anything good for other people. Then when I'm gone, no one's going to remember because they didn't remember me when I was alive, because I didn't do anything to be memorable in a spiritual sense. So then there will be no dua for me, there will be no fatihas for me, no remembrances for me. So these things that happen for us after our death are a factor of what we did while we were alive. Right? All those different ways, Rasulullah mentions 3 different ways that your book of deeds remains open, even though it's closed from so many perspectives. But if you have a child who prays for you, then your book of deeds is still added to, as long as that child or those generations of children continue to pray for you, then your book of deeds is still increasing, even though you're dead. Or if you've had some sort of a legacy of knowledge, you're able to write a book, you're able to teach something to somebody. You taught your kids how to read Quran, you taught them some good lessons. As long as those lessons continue to propagate, then that benefit and the reward of that accrues to the dead person. Or sadaqah jariyah, you contributed to the masjid, you contributed to the graveyard, you built an institution, you built a school, anything that you did that has longevity and continues to benefit people, then as long as people benefit from it, then you still get reward for it, even though you're dead. So these are the three ways that Rasulullah mentions that our good deeds continue to accrue after death. But if you look at them, all of them are actually extensions of our deeds while we're alive. How did I raise my kids while I was alive? That's going to determine how long they continue to remember me after I'm dead. Did I train them that this is how we treat dead people? This is how we pray for them. This is the importance of your parents, and do we make requests for them and wasiyah to them that please make sure to remember me after I'm dead and stay connected to me. And if I trained them and taught them, then they'll continue. If I wasn't a good parent, I didn't teach them, I didn't train them, then it's gone. Once I'm dead, then in a short time they'll forget about me, and then there's no more accruing of good deeds from that perspective. Same with the knowledge that I was able to teach. Same with the institutions that I was able to build. Those are all things that I did by my own choice while I was alive, and then the effects continue to accrue after I'm dead because those things keep on going. They keep on benefiting people. So the same for this dua then, Allahumma inna la na'lamu minhu or minha illa khayra. Because this person was one of our community members, who was our family member. And because of that, 50 of us, 100 of us have gathered together to now see him off. Now if we can all testify, even if it's a false testimony in reality, because maybe we all know that he sinned in one way or the other. But Allah is saying if you do this for him, then he's willing to overlook whatever sins he's committed, and because of your testimony, he'll forgive him. That's one possibility for justifying this phrase. Another possibility is that it's talking not about his actions, but his faith, his beliefs. We have two accounts. We have the account of our beliefs, and we have the account of our deeds. And typically our beliefs are more in line. Our deeds sometimes lag. We commit sins, we make mistakes. On a practical level, that's where we make our mistakes. But our beliefs are something that we tend to be very committed to. So when we are testifying and saying, Inna la na'lamu minhu illa khayra, perhaps you're testifying to the person's faith, that this person's a fellow Shi'i, he's a believer. We can testify that yes, he's one of us. Then we go on and we pray for his deeds. Allahumma in kana muhsinan fazid fi ihsanih, wa in kana musi'an fatajawaz anhu waghfir lah. With regard to his actions, whatever good he did, then increase that goodness. Whatever bad he did, then forgive him and forego those sins. That's with regard to the practical, the deeds. And we're taking both. We recognize that he did good actions, did bad actions. خَلَطُوا عَمَلًا صَالِحًا وَآخَرَ سَيِّئًا. And it's a mixture of good deeds and bad deeds in this person. But we make a prayer out of both. Whatever good he did, increase that goodness, give him multiple reward for that. Whatever bad he did, forgive it. But with regard to his beliefs, the fact that this is our Shi'i brother, this is our Shi'i sister, she had the same beliefs that we all stand by, we say, Inna la na'lamu minha illa khayra. We don't know anything from her but goodness. Because we don't know, we know that they're a member of our community, we know that they're Shi'i, that's as much as we need to say to Allah. He'll look into their heart and see, but we're testifying that yes, this is our Shi'i brother, Shi'i sister. And that testimony, Allah has given it that kind of nobility to say, if 40 of you will testify that for this person, then I'll forgive him. Salawat ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. Let me close there. So what we've talked about today, we were talking about nifaq, and then I wanted to bring up this issue of lying. Because lying also has this two-facedness to it, and it is a reprehensible action, a reprehensible attribute to have, that we are dishonest, that we lie, that we have one thing on the inside and say something different. But there are also certain exceptions, and so we looked at some of those exceptions that we have from ahadith, where the Ahlul Bayt have guided us to, instances where that same the false words that are incongruous with reality are actually justified, even mustahab, sometimes even wajib to do, for very important purposes that are more important than the preservation of truth. Any questions? All right. So inshallah we'll finish up tomorrow with a couple of more points about nifaq, and then I'll pass the torch to Shaykh Faizi. Let's stand for ziyarah. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم السلام عليك يا رسول الله السلام على الأئمة الهادين المهديين السلام على جميع أنبياء الله ورسله وملائكته السلام علينا وعلى عباد الله الصالحين السلام عليكم جميعا ورحمة الله وبركاته الله